Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me, and great to have you with me. Sicily, Sicilia, as it is known by those who live there, located between the eastern and western basins of the Mediterranean Sea. The island is an intermediary between Europe and Africa, a virtual bridge between the two continents, making it also the meeting place between Western Europe and the Middle East. It is located some 3 kilometers off the toe of Italy from the coast of Calabria. Its total area encompasses 25,460 square kilometers, making it the largest island in the Mediterranean Sea. And perhaps because of its link to the Levant and to Africa, as well as Europe, Sicilia might seem the very center of the civilized world. And I think this has caused it to be the envy of any powerful neighbor, as well as a meeting ground on which outside empires fought out their private quarrels. The island was an obvious base from which to attack the Italian mainland, just as it was an obvious base for the British fleet in their flight against Napoleon, and for Mussolini in his attempt to cut the Mediterranean in two. It was also always a refuge for pirates and smugglers who needed a secure post on land near the most important trade routes. Its conquerors and their periods of ruling, which is really quite amazing in terms of their number, makes one question who really are the Sicilians. Today, we are going to be concentrated on the periods in red: Byzantine, Muslim, Norman, Hohenstaufen, the German emperors, Angevin from Anjou, the Aragonese, and then the Spanish rule. All this fighting over Sicilia had consequences for those living there. And most of Sicilia's major cities were all coastal and susceptible to influences from the cultures that came to dominate these seas. And I want you to see Sicilia as this exotic fusion or confusion of cultures, which I believe has given its history some of its particular fascination. And I think you will understand by the end why it is one of my favorite destinations of European Jewish history. So today we're going to travel together to Sicilia to get to know not only who the Sicilians were, but also the Jews who lived there, particularly during the medieval and early modern times. On the one hand, we have a succession of invading peoples imposing themselves on society, layer upon layer. On the other hand, there is the underlying society itself, the subject population. And unfortunately, as I'm sure you appreciate, a conquering regime tends to leave far more memorials of itself than of those it rules, and therefore the actions and views of ordinary, naive citizens are often hard to know. And perhaps we need to realize how well our Jews are going to fit in within this existence and mentality. Jews in Sicilia are extremely productive, contributing, progressive members of the societies and the state in which they lived. They are used to being versatile and accommodating and acculturating. The Jews' encounter in Sicilia is a highly fluid one, riddled with ambivalence, the blurring of boundaries, cooperation as well as resistance, and a creative responsiveness to the other that has implications because their existence was unique. So let's meet our Jews of Sicilia. And I'm going to approach them in the following way. I'm going to introduce you to the Jews who lived under Muslim rule. What professions did they have? What was Jewish communal life like? And we will visit Europe's oldest mikveh in Syracuse that was used by Jews from the Muslim period onwards. We will then turn to the Christian rule, which starts from 1060. Documentation now is more ample. We will meet the Jewish scholars, the physicians, and the most famous messianic figure in Sicilia. We're also going to learn and see the remains of their synagogues and the extant Aron-Kodesh, the Holy Ark, and the Jews' home life in Sicilia before their expulsion, which happens on the 12th of January 1493, about half a year after the expulsion of Jews from Spain. But what is the starting point of the Jews in Sicilia? The truth is that very little is known of the Jews before the Arab conquest in the 9th century. It is generally assumed that the first Jews settled on the island in or about the 1st century of the Christian era, but no hard evidence has so far come to light to support this thesis. And the first concrete and dated documentary piece of evidence located to date is this epitaph on the tombstone of Aurelius Samuel and of his wife Lassie Ernin in Catania, which is dated to 383. Lassie Ernin died in that year at the age of 23. And the first line of the text is written in Hebrew and contains Samuel's name and the standard term, peace, etc., that is used on tombstones at this time, Shalom al Yisrael, Amen, Amen, Shalom, Shmuel. And we have more epitaphs in the late 4th and 5th centuries. Significantly, they are all on the east coast of Sicilia or near it. Catania, which was an ancient port at the foot of Mount Etna, from which half the inscriptions came, unless this was a mere accident, appears to have been the main Jewish center. At that time, Catania was also a major Sicilian emporium of trade with the Middle East. And it seems that this was the first place where Jews settled, and then they spread further west. By the 6th century, Jews are living in Palermo and were wealthy and numerous enough to have more than one synagogue. And note these brown and white street signs in the Old Quarter in 3 languages, Sicilian, Hebrew, and Arabic. And that is what you see, and you know that you have reached the Old Jewish Quarter in Palermo. And in fact, what we will see as we move forward are economically diversified Jewish communities with new Jews immigrating and settling on the island. And the diversification actually contributed significantly to the strength of the Jewish communities in Sicilia. So let's turn to the Muslim period between 827 and 1060. The Muslim conquest of Sicilia brought a positive change in the conditions of the Jews due to the changes the island underwent in the areas of agricultural innovation, religion, language, science, arts, and demography. And from certain viewpoints, this period was the most brilliant in Sicilia's history. They made Sicilia part of this splendid African civilization at the same time as a meeting point between Arabic, East European, and Latin cultures. And the capital of the island was transferred from Syracuse to Palermo, and Jews were already there, as we know. And Jews are now able to move from the often oppressive rule of the Byzantines to the relatively tolerant ones of the new rulers. And this change is going to affect the political and civil status of the Jews, their economic life, especially in regard to trade, their language, and culture. And what we know for sure is that it was not only the Muslim population which increased dramatically, so too did the number of Jews who now become an important factor of the island. And although no population figures are available for Jews on the island under the Arab duration, we know, as you can see from this list, where Jews came from: North Africa, Spain, Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and southern Italy. And their various ethnic backgrounds is manifest in the names used in Sicilian Jewish documents for synagogues. For example, Spanish Jews use the Arabic al-Hama, or al-Hama meaning congregation, while Jews from the East use the term Knessia, which was commonly used Arabic word designating a Christian church or a Jewish temple. Some Jews also use the Arabic term for mosque, mashib, to mean synagogue, while those native Sicilian Jews used the Greek term, which was synagogue. So Jewish life in Sicily no longer belonged to Europe. It was culturally and politically a part of Africa. And we need to imagine our Jews being comfortable under the Muslims. They adopt their dress, their language, and their culture. And later in the 13th century, Abraham Abulafia, who we're going to meet a little bit later tonight, noted this polyglot, the fact that Jews knew several languages, and this atmosphere at the time, which he looks at and he says the following: "But indeed, most remarkable is what happened to the Jews in Sicily, who did not speak only Italian or Greek, being the language of those together with whom they dwell, but have preserved the Arabic tongue, which they learnt in former times when the Ishmaelites dwelt there." And it's interesting too, if we think about the four main Muslim sources from this period, they don't really have much to say about Jews. But thanks, of course, to the wonderful Geniza documents, the Cairo Geniza, which accounts for more than half the documentary evidence of Jewish history in Sicilia, this really confirms for us that all the most important Jewish communities were at this point situated in Palermo, which became, during the Arab and later the Norman period, the center of Jewish life in all of Italy. Jews enjoyed some civil rights as dhimmis, non-Muslims. They paid a poll tax, which gave them security of person, property and worship, and the right to settle disputes among themselves in their own confessional courts. Most Jews lived in the main Jewish quarter, situated in the Casaro, the most ancient part of Palermo, though Jews also possessed houses and businesses elsewhere. And scholars have traced this topography, as you can see in this map, of Jewish Palermo, its streets and even many of its houses, the location of its public buildings, and the dwelling of some of its notables. But what professions were Jews doing? Well, firstly, we need to note that in Sicilia, only a few Jews were really well off or even rich. Most of the Jews were poor, and hence I think what is fascinating is that in Sicilia, we are looking at an account of ordinary Jews. Most Sicilian Jews were artisans and excellent craftsmen or goldsmiths. Hence my title tonight, The Jews of Sicily, and I've called them Creative Jews. They were employed in the royal palaces and even in chapels. They were merchants and laborers, including architectural ones. And notice this family name, Orefici, which becomes a Jewish family name, particularly in Sicily. Jews are also dyers, as in all Mediterranean countries. Another area of manual labor in which the Jews of Palermo, like those of other Sicilian towns, played a great role was tunny fishing, especially in Palermo and Trapani, as you see. And some had taverns, and they sold and drank kosher wine. We also know that Jews were involved in the coral industry, particularly making, and this is later period, rosaries as Christian objects for Christians to use. We also know that Jews were involved in medicine. It involved traditional practice and expertise on the one hand, and knowledge of the Arabic language on science on the other. Many of the doctors were scholars, rabbis, and judges, leaders of their communities and representatives with those ruling them. We also know of women, Jewish women, who were practicing as physicians in Sicily. There were also astronomers and mathematicians, translators, playing of this important part in the work of translation of Arabic into European tongues, and Jews were merchants and traders, and the Geniza documents confirm that the Jewish businessmen had this significant share in Mediterranean trade already in the 10th and 11th centuries. Some Jews were clearly ship owners, at least sharing the ownership of vessels, and goods exported was a huge amount: food, precious minerals, metals, textiles, finished clothing, cotton, silk, and a variety of silk, particularly of the Sicilian kind. And goods brought in included Egyptian and North African flax, spices such as pepper and cinnamon, aromatic and perfumes such as aloe and camphor, cloves and mastic gum, medical herbs as well, odoriferous woods, chemicals, and manufacturing materials such as dyes, pearls, beads, jewels, precious stones, oil, sugar, soap, and wax. So this overwhelming number of artisans and craftsmen and the variety of pursuits, including some that one does not normally associate with medieval Jews, make the Sicilian Jews unique. Well, what about Jewish life? Under Islam, the Jews had their own substantial autonomy with an officially recognized Jewish judge who was in charge of them in each city. And one name that we have is Rabbi Masliach ben Eliyahu el-Bazak. He was a major rabbinic presence in the 1030s and 1040s in Sicilia. He had studied in Baghdad with Rabbi Chai Gaon and was an author of Halachic Responsa, which unfortunately now is lost. And when the Jewish community nominated and elected their leaders, the Geniza documents confirmed that they had the approval of the Muslim rulers before they could formally take office. And this same thing applied to Jewish judges, who, as we can see from Rabbi Masliach, were probably all rabbis. And the Geniza documents also suggests that the leaders of the Jewish communities of Palermo attained great status due to their knowledge in Jewish law. They received the respect of Jewish jurists beyond the island, and they were asked to render expert opinion by Jewish judges abroad. And in one such case, a Jewish judge in Egypt sought the opinion of his counterpart in Palermo. And in keeping with their prestigious status, Sicilian Jewish scholars kept in close contact with scholars in North Africa, in Spain, in Egypt, and Palestine. And obviously, the Jewish courts had to tread carefully between Jewish and governmental law, religious and civil, whereas criminal law was the government's prerogative. And under Jewish law, when the law of the land conflicted with Jewish law, the former took precedence. That there were Jewish schools and academies under the Muslims is certain, but little specific knowledge, I'm afraid, is available to us of the educational system that has survived. Well, what do we know of Jewish communal life under Islam in Sicilia? Well, it seems that during the Muslim period, Jewish communities were established in a dozen or so localities, including Palermo, Messina, Catania, Siracusa, Trapani, and the ones listed here. And I want us to look at Siracusa a little more closely because of its extant mikveh and what this mikveh can tell us about Jewish life at the time. By the way, anyone who in the future will travel, please God, to Sicilia, interested in Jewish history, needs to spend time in Siracusa. It is the most powerful, visible reminder for us of the Jewish presence during the Muslim time. The Jewish quarter in Siracusa is on the Ortigia, the island peninsula jutting out, as you can see, into the sea. And here, and as elsewhere, the Jews had all of the communal institutions they needed: synagogues, a mikveh, a cemetery, a ritual slaughterhouse, a hospital, a court, a school, and taverns that served kosher wine. The cemetery no longer exists, as it is now covered by seawater, although blocks of stone bearing Hebrew inscriptions have been uncovered and started to be uncovered in 1962, telling us the names of Jews who lived there, and here I have listed them on the side. The Jews settled in this eastern side of Ortigia by design. They wanted to symbolically face Jerusalem. Siracusa is on the east side of the island. And what we have remaining from the Muslim period is the oldest mikveh in Europe. And I want us to imagine Jews using it during this time. It probably dates from the 6th century during the Byzantine period in Sicilia. The mikveh was uncovered in 1987 when architects were working on the conversion of an old building into a hotel. They discovered a staircase of 52 steps, which takes you 18 meters down, that's 59 feet, beneath street level. The stairs were mostly dug out of rock. In the middle of a large underground central hall, there are 3 ritual baths arranged in a clove leaf, still filled with pure water, that flows in and out through the cracks in the rock. Each mikveh has 6 steps to access the 140 centimeter deep water. There are also long benches on 2 corners of the room, which allow us to imagine the considerable number of visitors. There are also 3 tiny corridors leading from the main room, 2 of which after a sharp turn at a right angle, designed to ensure the bather's privacy. The natural water would have come from natural canals that functioned as siphons through the soil underlying that stretch of sea which separated the island of Ortigia from the mainland. And the angular distance of the bath was necessary for a population that has been calculated as being as many as 3,000 Jews in Syracusa, though this figure probably relates to the Christian period, later period, than that of the Muslim, but I think it's still important. The mikveh was probably built in Syracusa before its first synagogue. And since in medieval Italy, a new Jewish community would first build their mikveh and then collect the funds for a synagogue or a Torah scroll. And we know that a synagogue was built in Syracusa in the 7th century, as well as Jewish hospital. So the mikveh is older. The mikveh in Syracusa is older than the mikveh in Palermo, which was probably built in the 10th century. And it's not as famous and it's not as touristy as that in Syracusa. It is under the 15th century Palazzo Marchesi, and you really, as you can see here, can't see as much and don't have that incredible sense of an active mikveh that you have in Syracusa. And these are the remains we have of Jewish life from this period. So now we need to go on, and we need to come to the Norman period, a Christian period, of course. And it's the Norman invasion which took Sicilians back permanently into the orbit of Europe. And so ended what was for the Jews a relative golden age, as it had been for the Jews of Spain. The Normans come in 1060, 6 years before other Normans would make their momentous conquest of England, as we're going to see next week. And so far as we can tell, the Norman conquerors did nothing really to disturb the prior patterns of Jewish existence in the territories that they conquered. Note, these rulers do not come themselves to the island. They have viceroys and rulers that rule for them locally in Palermo. But like their Iberian Christian counterparts, they are tolerant of Jews and concluded that the Jews could be useful allies in the effort to maintain the high level of civilization in the areas now under their control. And the marks on the landscape of the Norman presence in Sicilia are these Norman castles, royal castles. Each city was dominated by one built, usually on strategic points inland. These are not residential castles, but military. And what we have to take into account is that under the Normans, the Jews of Sicilia returned to Christian rule, which also means, as it always does with Christian rulers, a return to church legislation, Christian missionary efforts, such as forced sermons that Jews had to attend to. Arabic still remained a language of government and administration for at least a century after the Normans came. But still things are easier in Sicilia than other places in Europe. And what is actually fascinating is that the Normans themselves were reported to have brought Jews from Greece into Sicilia. And according to a 13th century chronicle, the Annales Cavenses, compiled in the province of Salerno in southern Italy between, we think, about 1105 and 1154, King Roger II sent his fleet against Byzantium, capturing Corfu, Kephallonia, Thebes, Corinth, and the rest of the coast as far as Malvasia. And he brings with him into Sicilia Jewish weavers of damask, of brocade and silk, and then he settles them in Palermo. And he certainly deserves credit for raising the numbers of Jews in Sicilia. And it's interesting because, again, we're questioning the population at this time, and we can rely on the wonderful traveller Benjamin of Tudela, who tells us, he comes to the island in 1170, and he talks of 200 Jews in Messina, of 1,500 Jews in Palermo, and he calls Palermo the largest Jewish community in Italy at this time. And what we're going to see over the next few centuries is an influx of Jews, not just from Greece, but also from Morocco. The Jews seem to have found a hospitable reception. They are allowed to erect their own synagogues and reside in all major Sicilian towns. And there is every reason to believe that the kingdom of Sicilia during the 13th century contained the most numerous, the most populous, and the most industrious Jewish communities in all Italy. And we are looking at an upward of 21 Jewish communities on the coast, which allows them to trade. And we now see our Sicilian Jews enjoying their own form of Hebrew poetry, like that of Spain, which for me is always a sign that life is good. Sicilian regarded Spanish Jews and their poetic competence with some awe, as opposed to the rather cynical attitude towards this poetry by the Jews of Ashkenaz. But who are our Sicilian Jewish poets? Well, one Jewish poet, whose name was Anatoly ben Yosef, originally a native of Marseille, born around 1150, we think, who later becomes the Dayan of Alexandria in Egypt, left his collection of poetry. Anatolia is also known to us as being a correspondent with the Rambam. We know this from the collection of letters and responsa of the Rambam. And we think Anatolia came to Sicilia between about 1170 and 1180 on his way to Egypt and took up abode first in Palermo. And while in Sicilia, Anatoly becomes friends with another Jewish poet, Eliakim was his name, whom Anatoly goes to visit when he is sick and writes a poem to him that laughed at the dangers of wine drinking and offered a riddle. Now, like in Spain, Anatoly and his friends do not consider it beneath them to accompany these very lively banquets that they hold with Bacchic Hebrew songs and riddles, written, of course, in the most perfect Hebrew. These riddles become this sort of kind of literary pastime, much enjoyed during these wine-drinking parties. Now, although the witty allusions of the original cannot be rendered adequately in translation, I wanted to share with you a translation of part of a riddle, just to give us the sense of this enjoyment at this feast among the Jews. My honored friend, listen to my chosen words and declare wine a traitor. The vine became pregnant from the son of the cloud. Very soon it bore a male child. Spit its blood with a knife. Nobody will care to revenge its blood. Consider its cost as not worth mentioning, and call the publican who sold it a generous man. In a crystal cup, give me of that excellent wine, so that I may perhaps become drunk. If you can guess at my meaning, I shall offer a present for your table. And what is clear is that Sicilian Jewish propensity for wide-ranging cultural creativity continued to manifest itself even at this time. So let's move forward. What about when we come to the Hohenstaufen, this dynasty of German kings who ruled Sicilia between 1194 and 1266? Well, the Hohenstaufen seem to have changed little, again, the circumstances of the Jewish community of Sicily. But there is one king that I want us to pay attention to. With the accession of King Frederick I of Sicilia in 1221, also Emperor Frederick II, the brilliant Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, King of Sicilia and Apulia, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor, things turn a little worse, mainly because of a conflict that he's having with the papacy. So there now is this additional pressure coming from the church. And he himself actually comes to Sicilia and orders Jews to wear a blue linen garment and to grow beards. Jewish women were to wear blue bands on their upper garment and on their heads. Transgressors, he said, were to be punished with the confiscation of their property or branding if without means. But nothing is known of the enforcement, and you can sort of feel that he's coming with this pressure from the papacy, which anyway is demanding that Jews wear badges at this time. But Frederick doesn't stop there. The greatest change introduced by Frederick in the status of Jews of Sicilia, one that endures until the end of their presence on the island, was this definition of Jews as servi camerae regis, serfs of the royal chamber. And the employment of this term in the empire undoubtedly indicated a deterioration of the Jews' status, that they could be taxed whenever they wanted, although they do have protection as a result of this. And this is something that really changes for the worse. And even though Jews are still international merchants at this time, there is a suggestion from the Genueser letters that during the period of the Hohenstaufens, the commercial and personal links between Sicilia and the Middle East continued, but at a reduced rate. And in all likelihood, that was due to diminished volumes and the shift of trade to other regions in the Mediterranean. We know that in 1239, during the reign of Frederick II, a group of Jews came from North Africa to live in Palermo and expressed the wish to develop the royal date palm plantation near Palermo, since they were experts in this field. Again, the creative Jews that I mentioned earlier. And the fact that they were all Arabic speaking made their assimilation somewhat easier, since life in the western half of the island, where most of them settled, still retained this strong Arabic, if no longer Muslim flavor. And Frederick even granted them permission to rebuild a derelict synagogue and to obtain housing outside the Casaro, the traditional Jewish quarter in the capital, and permission to appoint their own rabbi. Now, only a few other Genueser letters from this period have a bearing on Sicilia. And one instance I wanted to share with you is a responsum by the Rambam to a legal question raised by the Jewish community in Syracuse. It was about a eunuch who had married a widow. And Maimonides categorically states that the Jewish court must compel the couple to separate. But he adds this little afterthought, and he says the following. The Rambam gives us an indication that he's not that happy with the level of learning being conducted in Syracuse. And he describes the Jews there as, quote, not versed in the Torah to comprehend the responsum unless it is well explained. And I think that's quite interesting to give us this sort of rather cynical attitude that he has to the level of learning in Syracuse. We also know at this time of one Jewish physician. His name was Master Busach, who was rendering medical services to the king, and hence was very likely to be a royal familiar, like his successors. And it seems then that in the 13th century, Jewish physicians abounded in Sicilia, and many of them achieving eminence in non-Jewish circles as well. Well, what do we know about Jewish communal life at this time? Well, all the Jewish communities on the island were well organized and closely knit. They enjoyed local autonomy, held occasional representative assemblies to deliberate on matters of common interest, levied their own taxation, enforced decisions, whether in financial or administrative matters. And the executive officers at the head of each community were known as sindaci, which is the Italian word for mayors in Italian, and they were chosen in rotation for 3 months or longer periods. But when we look at these important leaders or rabbis in Sicilia, what do we find? Well, unfortunately, there are few names of Sicilian Jewish scholars in the sphere of rabbinic and Talmud studies at this time, compared to what we saw last time in Ashkenaz. We know that Trapani had a house of learning where the Palazzo della Giudecca that stands today was, and this was the main seat of Talmudic studies in 1485. In terms of scholars, none of them are really first rank, but there are 2 notable names that we should think about for a moment. Beginning in the 13th century, we have Meir ben Moses, who taught halakha, and he either came from or else settled in Sicilia, but though he was highly regarded in his day, only fragments of his writings in prose or verse have survived. But considerable attention has been attracted of late to the writings of the poet and physician Achitub ben Isaac or Yitzchak, and he was the leading figure of the Jewish community of Palermo in the late 13th century, to whom Rabbi Solomon or Shlomo ben Adret of Barcelona addressed in his capacity when he was concerned about this mystic that we're going to learn about in a moment. And he was an interesting man, the Achitob ben Isaac. He wrote his most memorable work, which was called Ha-Machberet Hatene, or Composition of the Basket, and this was written in rhymed prose and verse, which describes, though without much vivacity, a visit to paradise, approximating or perhaps even, I think, anterior date to Dante's Divine Comedy. So what colorful figures do we have in Sicilia at this time? Well, it's at this point that we need to meet Abraham Abulafia, an incredibly colorful and provocative figure responsible for the ecstatic form of Kabbalah that reaches Sicily. This ecstatic form was very different from anywhere else. Abulafia had been born in Saragossa in Spain in the Hebrew year 5000. So note the date. This is going to be the start of the 6th millennium and a year of apocalyptic expectation in some Jewish circles. Of course, this correlates to the Christian Gregorian calendar date of 1240. And Abraham Abulafia goes to the Holy Land when he was 20. He then spends time in Greece, in southern Italy, and then again in Catalonia in Spain, where he studies and he taught Rambam's Mavo Nevuchim, his guide for the perplexed. At the end of the 1260s, he arrives in Barcelona, and 1270, he starts to study Kabbalah and Ashkenazi pietism and receives a revelation which inspires him to believe that he is the expected Messiah, Mashiach. And during the year 1280, he composes 2 of his most important books, a commentary on the guide named Sitrei HaTorah, Mysteries of the Torah, and an important and most influential mystical handbook, Sefer Chaye HaOlam Haba, Book on Life in the World to Come. An intensive preparation and further visions leads Abulafia to attempt to meet Pope Nicholas III in Rome. But the Pope dies of apoplexy on the very night before Abulafia had hoped to meet him, which was the 22nd of August, 1280. Abulafia is imprisoned for 2 weeks by the Franciscan friars in Rome. Subsequently, he settles in Sicilia in 1282 for a decade, and it's there that he really composes many of his remarkable treatises. And one of them was Or HaSechel, or the light of the intellect. And I really have to underscore the fact that Abulafia's Kabbalistic writings are the most voluminous literary corpus ever written by a Jew in Sicilia. This corpus contains almost 2,000 pages, and it is mostly still unedited and extant only in manuscript form. And the fact that he dedicated almost all the books he wrote in Sicilia to his students indicates that he spent most of the period between 1280 and 1291 in Messina. And of course, claims of prophetic capabilities coupled with apocalyptic messianic ideology are extremely dangerous to rabbinic authority. And the leaders of the Jewish community in Palermo approached the greatest authority on Jewish religious life of Aragonese Jewry, Rabbi Shlomo ben Abraham ibn Adret of Barcelona, the leading halachic authority at the time, to ask what they should do. Abulafia's claim to be a prophet was a matter of serious concern for Ibn Adret. He, Adret, fiercely assaulted Abulafia's messianic and prophetic claims in an epistle he sent to a number of people in Palermo. Solomon ibn Adret emphatically stated that the idea that one can prophesy outside of Israel is against all accepted tradition. Therefore, Abulafia could not be a prophet because he did not meet the necessary criteria for this role. Abulafia would not accept this. According to him, if one had the requisite knowledge and the right temperament, one could become a prophet. And it's perhaps no coincidence that Abulafia disappears from the historical stage in later 1290 or 1291, although what happened to him actually remains a mystery. But Ibn Adret refers to Abulafia as that trickster. May the name of the wicked rot Abraham, who set himself up as a prophet and Messiah in Sicilia, who seduced with his falsehoods some of the children of Israel. And he continued, had I not slammed the door in his face, by the mercy of God, with his imaginary and false teachings, he would have started his messianic activity and would have annihilated the community. And what I want to conclude from this episode is that Sicilia thus becomes a center for this dissemination of a certain rather unique and certainly controversial type of Kabbalah. So we're moving forward, and we're moving towards the late 13th century, when the Catalan Aragonese come into Sicilia. We're going to feel a tightening from the end of the 13th century when the Spanish arrive. And the fascinating thing is, and here are the rulers of, again, in Aragon and then in Spain, not really in Sicily, but sending their viceroys. What we have at this time is we are looking at an upward of 60 Jewish communities all over the island, about 4.5 to 5% of the total Sicilian population. And from 1282 to 1310, there is little discussion of Jews. But in 1310 already, we have a new series of constitutions by the kings to renew the canonical restrictions against Jews. And these are restrictions that we often see related to medieval experience of Jews under Christians at this time. What about communal institutions? What are we looking at in Sicilia? Tens of new synagogues were built there under the Aragonese. Many were repaired and enlarged right down to the date of the Jews' expulsion. For example, the famous synagogue in Syracuse, known to be situated where now sits this roofless St. John the Baptist Church. Its original structure can be dated back to the end of the 13th century due to its interior Romanesque, decorative particularities that definitely was where the synagogue was. Now, I want to tell you something interesting. When you go to visit this church in Syracuse, and if you go as a Jewish tourist, you won't be allowed in. You'll see this sign on the outside that says this, and I'm reading the English because we're an English crowd, this Roman church, never been synagogue, unauthorized group visits are prohibited. But what we know without doubt is that this is not the case, that this was where the main synagogue in Syracuse was because of these two Hebrew inscriptions that you see on the left of the screen. The first is engraved on a stone ashlar. It was placed upside down at the top of the right side of the central apse of the church, and its meaning is to the synagogue of Syracuse, established in righteousness and faith. So definitely, without doubt, this is the place. There's another Hebrew inscription that was found there. Berachach, son of Mesa Saadia the Old, reposes in Eden, known as Fakas. He donated 2/3 of the land of the synagogue of Dechal, belonging to his family heritage, while he was alive. And this is where the synagogue was. What about in Palermo? Well, the main synagogue in Palermo was actually called the Great Synagogue and was admired by numerous travelers from all corners of the earth. And it was in the center of the Jewish quarter. We don't have it existing anymore, but we know that it was situated pretty much now where the main city archives were. We do have a lovely report of the Palermo synagogue, particular by Ovadia ben Abraham of Bartanora that you see here. He visits Sicily in the 15th century, and he talks about the beauty of the synagogue. And I wanted to share with you just one point that he makes because of what we're going to be seeing in a few minutes' time. He talks about the Aron Kodesh, which he says is actually made and situated on a wooden platform. And this is something that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. There are no physical remains of the synagogue now in Palermo, and the suggestion was that the Jews destroyed it because they did not want it to be turned into a church. After the expulsion of the Jews, it was transformed into a church that was called Santa Maria della Popolo, later became a convent of the Augustinians, and was called the Church and Monastery of Saint Niccolò Tolentino. Yet this block is still known as La Mosquita, as the synagogue was called by the Muslims and then Christians. And in the later 19th century, part of the synagogue and the monastery's ruins were rebuilt, as I said before, into the city archives. But, and this is the most amazing thing, and this is surely, I think, a clear reflection of the growing community in Sicily, and we'll talk more about this at the end, the Jewish community in Palermo have now been given a new space to build their own synagogue. The last time I was there, this is what it looked like, but I'm hoping that on a future trip it will actually be an acting synagogue of the Jewish community in Palermo. I'm going to take you to two more places, if I may, before we finish. It is a place which housed, I should say, a beautiful synagogue, and is called Agira, another must on a Jewish history trip to Sicilia. Halfway between Enna and Catania, straddling the valleys formed by the Salso and Diteno rivers, this is a place whose views can be admired from various viewpoints. In fact, there is very little of the synagogue left now. What is left is this, an Aron Kodesh, a holy ark, the only Aron that remains in Sicilia. The Aron was built around 1454, and it was made for an active community. A document of 14th of January 1489 confirms for us that the Jewish community of Agira was such a community in Sicilia. This Aron Kodesh is absolutely breathtaking. Usually, as we saw from Ovadia, the Aron Kodesh was probably made in wood. What we have here is a stone, and is one made from stone. And strangely enough, it is situated inside this church, the local church of Santissimo Salvatore in Aggregato. The inscription in Hebrew in the high part of the Aron, which you can see really hopefully just a couple of words at the top, states, "House of Jacob, come in and walk in the Lord's light," which obviously comes from Isaiah. But notice this as well, that the Jews, and these are the creative Jews of Sicily, were very conscious of living under the Aragonese and therefore put in the middle of their Aron Kodesh the actual coat of arms of the Aragon. Now this is the label next to where the Aron Kodesh stands in the church, and I must tell you that having been inside the church and had a wonderful conversation with the priest in charge, he really dedicates and looks after with this Aron and feels a real affinity to looking after it. The site of the synagogue is nearby. It's now an empty shell. It's a few hundred yards away, and if you go into the church and you see the Aron, make sure you can get details from the priest as to where this empty shul, where the synagogue used to be. And you can see even from this where the Aron Kodesh would have fitted in to this to the wall that faces east. The synagogue was actually left abandoned for more than a century, and then in the 17th century it was changed into a hermitage, the dwelling of a hermit, by the Blessed Diego from Sinagra of the Minor Friars. After that it was used as an oratory by the Brotherhood of the Holy Cross. Nowadays, as you can see, it is deserted again. Another place I want to take you to is Aggregato. Aggregato became one of the most important cities of the island, exporting grain, cotton, hides, sugar and salt to North Africa and Spain. Aggregato was an important town during the Muslim period and was also one in which the Jewish dyeing industry flourished. And here in the parochial church of Siciliana, there has been kept a wash basin, a kior, which was formerly at the entrance of the synagogue in Aggregato, located in the Contrada Ruga Reali. The basin was donated, as you can see, in the name of one Samuel Benyona Siburi, and here I'm going to show you because this is the best slide, who had probably been a member of the shul, and the date of the donation is 74 to 75. For me, this kior, which is clearly now used as a baptismal font in the church, was absolutely spectacular. When you walk into a church, you don't expect to see a Jewish object, a kior with a Hebrew inscription locked up on the left in a small chapel. But this represented for me the last creative period of Jewish life before the expulsion. Active communities whose population numbered 25,000 in all of Sicilia at this time. And so, unfortunately, we have to come to the expulsion of the Jews. Obviously, I have not dealt with the reasons for expulsion, but let me just sum them up here. The Dominicans, the Franciscan friars, and their supporters imported into Sicilia the anti-Jewish propaganda which they had disseminated through Western Europe during the later Middle Ages. They were the engineers of the collapse of the relative convivencia, the coexistence between Jews and Christians in Sicilia. The Edict of Expulsion was imported from Spain because Sicilia is being ruled by the same Spanish that are ruling in Spain. They bring this edict into Sicilia. And it's slightly worded differently, but not essentially. These males and female Jews must leave and depart from all our said kingdoms and dominions within 3 months following the publication of the present, so that after that date no Jew, male or female, big or small, of whatever age, may stay anywhere in our kingdoms or dominions, nor may return there to stay or pass through them on pain of death and the confiscation of property by our chamber and treasury. The alleged reasons for it in Spain were irrelevant to Sicilia, but that was immaterial so far as the Catholic monarchs were concerned. Sicilia did not have a secret Jewish converso, Marrano problem as existed in Spain. Jews had always lived openly as Jews until their expulsion in 1493. There had been no Inquisition before the Jews' expulsion from Sicilia. With this expulsion order, only a minority stay in Sicilia and convert. And it has been estimated that the number of Sicilian Jews who convert to Christianity in order to stay there was probably about 5,000, out of a total of what we said before, 25,000, which means about 20% of Jews stay. When the Jews leave Sicilia, where do they go? Well, we know they went to Naples. We know they went to Rome because we have a Scuola Siciliana, a Sicilian synagogue in Rome very soon after this. They also went to Terracina in Italy. We know of Sicilian communities in Istanbul, in Salonika, in Jerusalem, in Sfat and even Damascus, in Corfu and in Zante. But compared with the Iberian tribunals which tried and executed thousands of converts, the Sicilian tribunal was remarkably restrained. And in all its activities, we know of it burning 195 converts in person, and that's much less, of course, than happened either in Spain or Sicily. And why so many less people? Well, I think in the first place, it should be borne in mind that the total number of converted Jews in Sicilia was by no means comparable to what happens in the Iberian Peninsula. There's also a local resistance to the Inquisition, its geographical distance from the Iberian Peninsula, and lack of trustworthy personnel. But what I wanted to share with you, and this is a very recent find in Sicilia, but I think an incredibly important one. This is inside the Steri Palace. The Steri Palace in Palermo was historically the place where the viceroys or those rulers lived. But during about 1600 to 1762, it becomes the home of the Inquisition. The Inquisition is inside this palace. And what has been unearthed recently are actually the cells, the places where those who were being prosecuted by the Inquisition were kept. And what we found is incredible expression of secret Jewish life. I wanted to share with you this one particular image, which sort of shows us this Leviathan, this sort of huge sea creature. But out of it come these, the Jewish patriarchs, the most important figures in the Hebrew Bible, which I think confirms for us this love and this passion that was kept on by the secret Jews of Sicilia. And the most amazing thing is, if you just think of some of the things that were kept alive by these Jews, that they kept up circumcision, they kept up Shabbat, donating oil, providing Jewish education for their children, and they tried to keep away from the Christianity that they were supposed to be part of. They would avoid the sacraments. They would try not to go to church on Sundays, and they would express under the surface their disgust for Christian practices, confession, and Christian ritual in general. And the one last picture I wanted to share with you, if I may, is this lighting of the Chanukiah that was recently done in 2013. Well, it's not so recent anymore, but it seems recent. 520 years after the Jews' expulsion. It was done in the Steri Palace, close to where the Jews, the secret Jews, had done their graffiti. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry if I've gone too fast. It's been a wonderful experience. And I hope soon that you will have a chance to travel to Jewish Sicily.
Thank you very much, Kathy. There are, of course, plenty of questions and plenty of comments. I'm going to choose one or two out of them. There are a few questions regarding Jewish life in Sicily today. Do you know what there is today? How many people live there?
I haven't got a precise figure. It's interesting how Jews came back. A lot of Jews came back in the 1930s. And then more recently, Jews have been settling there. But there has also been a wonderful effort to find these secret Jews and to welcome them into the Jewish community. And when I was there, I did have a pleasure of meeting some of these who are involved. So this is a growing community, and it's also about bringing those who feel that they have some sort of Jewish roots, some sort of connection, because, you know, the Converso story is one that we can talk about, obviously in relation to any place where the Jews had to go under the surface and secretly practice their Judaism. So people who, and we've, you know, lighting candles in closed cupboards and have been doing this for generations and not quite sure why, you know, these are the people who at this point are making contact with the Jewish community. And it's really wonderful to see a growing community that's accepting. And as I showed you before, in that picture, this is going to be their new synagogue in Palermo, which is exciting.
So Baruch was asking, how do you explain the contradiction between different restrictions on the Jews while many synagogues were built under Aragon rulers?
I think there was a need, I mean, there was always a question of the Jews having one synagogue wherever they lived. And there was a sense that Christianity understood that. The Jews needed a place to pray. It was something that they would keep on being badgered by them if they didn't. There were so many communities at this time in the 15th century before they're expelled. And the Jews are given that right. They're allowed to have the synagogue. As long as they keep their prayers down, they don't make too much noise, they're allowed to practice inside that synagogue. And it's something, it's sort of something, it's tolerance by the Christian rulers to the Jews. They're not going to stop them from that religious practice.